Hello everybody, it's Jade. This week's episode is coming a little bit late because I had a work trip last week, which I told myself I would be able to record a video during, and then, to the surprise of absolutely no one, I was not able to because it was a work trip. So now I am back at my house and recording this week's episode, which is a very special episode because I have a very interesting and special surprise. But I'm hoping that that very interesting and special surprise will become a staple of this entire video series and not just a one-time thing. So we will see. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what is the surprise? And will Jade stretch this out until the end of the episode? And the answer is no. The surprise is, I have someone to collaborate with. Her name is Mitch. If you are watching this video series and you are part of the Hive fandom, you've probably met her at some point. She goes by Mitch online, or Mitchell, and she has a blog on Tumblr called Dr. Nero is God. Anyway, she holds a degree in English literature or something that I should have checked before this that is extremely relevant to the topic that I cover on this YouTube channel, which is analyzing literature that's in English. But most importantly, we got into an argument online a couple of weeks ago about the different themes present in Hive, and she absolutely wiped the floor with me. So the following morning, I asked her to please do this video series with me. So this week, she is going to be talking about Cypher. We're at this point, because we haven't quite figured out the technological how to do things, she has her section that she sent me that I'm going to put closer to the end of this video. And she's going to be analyzing the antagonist from this one. And I'm going to talk about just stuff that she didn't cover there. We might change the format up a little bit later, or she might decide that she doesn't like working with me and she never wants to come back. But for right now, that's what we're doing. So I will put the timestamp for when she starts talking about that in the description in case you just don't care about what I have to say. So without further ado, let's talk about the Overlord. The Overlord Protocol, which is the second book in the Hive series. So, to be completely honest, last week when I started reading book one, I was concerned. This is one of my favorite pieces of media of all time, this series, but I was not impressed with book one. I mean, I didn't like it as much as I remembered liking it. Now, I'd always remembered that I liked book one the least, but there was a lot that I didn't like about it. I think mostly the fat jokes kind of put me off. But I remembered not liking the Overlord Protocol very much when I read it first as a kid. Now, obviously, actually not obviously, when I first started reading the series, the first two were the only two that were out in America. So I had to ask my parents to actually import the rest of the series for me from Europe. So I liked the Overlord Protocol enough that I waited a very long time and begged my parents a lot to spend a lot of money to import the rest of the series for me. However, I do remember not liking this one very much. So after not liking the first one very much last week, I was genuinely afraid of what was going to happen when I read this one. And honestly, this one's amazing. I couldn't put it down. I don't know why I didn't like this one when I was a kid, but I really liked it this time around. Everybody has an arc. The narration in this one is way better. There's a lot less focus on how special Otto is and how Otto thinks that he's the very best and everybody else sucks. Everybody has an arc. Instead of it just being Otto narrating 70% and then Nero and Contessa sharing 30% like it was in book one, this one is split fairly evenly between, in narration-wise, between Otto, Laura, Nero, and Raven, who are the people who primarily are going to narrate most of the rest of the series. And it just feels more like a Hive book. I know if you are following along with this, reading the series, then that's probably not information that you wanted to know, but there. But switching between perspectives just seems more better for Mark Walden. The writing style changes as we switch between people. The plot happening all over the place is just more suited to Mark Walden's writing style, and I really want to talk about that later, how the way that Mark Walden develops a story so that you are surprised at the end is by bombarding you with more information than you are really able to figure out if you're reading it at a normal pace. Now, if you stop and read each of these chapters and then like reread them and think about, what's coming, you can almost certainly figure out the ending to this book in advance. But if you're just reading it, there is too much going on for you to figure out everything. And he's not expecting you to figure out nothing. He's expecting you to figure out maybe 2 out of the 5 of the different things that are going on, so that you're surprised on the 3 different elements that you didn't figure out, which is something that I really like about Mark Walden's writing. The last book in the series, Bloodline, came out last week, and I told everybody last week, in the last video, that I wasn't going to read it, but I found out too much about it, in like literally before it even came out, and I kept asking people about it and stuff. I knew I couldn't hold out, so I read the first chapter and a half that's available for free online, because it's going to take forever for it to get imported here from Europe, just like when I was in the 8th grade. And even though I've read this series like 6 times, or there's parts of the series that I've read 6 times, there was stuff in the first 2 chapters that I hadn't figured out, despite the fact that I have done a lot of thinking about, how's this going to end? I have no idea, and that's awesome, and it's a staple of Mark Walden's writing that I really enjoy, and it's why we are here examining this instead of examining something else. What else? There's actual narration. Everybody has an arc. There's a story instead of just exposition. We have the Mark Walden maneuver, which is a total bombardment of too many plot lines for you to reasonably figure out what's going on in advance. Finally, there are way more nice people in this one. A staple of the Hive series, obviously, it being about self-professed bad guys, is that there are some real jerks among the cast. But if you have a cast of all jerks, it's boring, right? In this book, there is noticeably more variation in the attitudes between the characters. Otto in book 1 was largely like Nero Jr., basically. Nero was a jerk. Number 1 was an even bigger jerk. And Otto was the short 13-year-old jerk. And then Laura was nice, and everybody else was varying shades of also a jerk, except for Wing, who was quiet. In this one, the personalities are way more differentiated. It's not just whether you're nice or not. It's why are you nice? What are your goals? How do you behave? What's your philosophy on how you treat people? Which is just a huge improvement. Not to bash on book 1 too much, but this one, I was just surprised by how much more I liked this one. Yeah. So let's get into what actually happens in this one. So from this point on, most if not all of the books rely heavily on flashbacks. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in the present time, and then there's going to be something that's going on that is interleaved with the present timeline that happened in the past. What I'm going to do for the rest of this video series is just cover things in chronological order. So whatever happened in the flashbacks is going to go first, and then everything else. I'm not going to screw around with going back and forth, especially later. I think it's 7, where it's like every other chapter happened 30 years ago or something, and that's just not practical to cover in this format. Obviously, 7 is my favorite, but so the flashback in this one is framed in the context of Nero remembering an old friend of his, potentially an old flame, named Shu Mei. Now, for all of you Mandarin speakers in the audience, I apologize in advance for the way I'm about to slaughter this woman's name, or the pronunciation of her name. I listened to some Chinese pronunciation guides online, and ultimately I think I'm still obliterating it. As we know, last book, Nero was given, now we know that Nero was given a necklace that previously belonged to Wing's mother. He doesn't know what it is, but he does know that people have just tried to kill him to get it. He thought that Wing's mother died, so we find out the story behind that. We find out that Wing's mother, a woman named Shumei Chen, she was this incredibly talented AI programmer who was leading a project to develop what you may know as being called a generalized AI. That means something that is not just for one purpose, but for theoretically any purpose. It should be able to solve its own problems and think by itself. Maybe not any purpose, but like most purposes. This AI being called Overlord and having a personality and having the ability to interact with other people. Now, we don't know right now why Overlord was built, but we do know that they are trying to get this thing done as quickly as possible, for a couple of reasons. It looks like this project has been going on for a long time and Nero just wants it to be finished, but also there's sort of an element of this thing is being built for a reason and we need it. Now, we don't know what that is yet, but it's being developed in this completely closed off facility in the mountains of northern China. And Shumei is in charge of a team of engineers who are developing this AI. And one of those other engineers is a man named Wu Zhang. Shumei is the sort of beacon of goodness and innocence that we've seen so far in the series. She's idealistic, she's talented, she believes that everything is going to work out. It seems to look like Nero may like her in the romantic sense, but at minimum he does think that she's pretty. And I do think that you are supposed to, at this point, at least a little bit be reminded of Laura. Laura, who is this beautiful and brilliant and kind programmer who just always believes that everything's going to be okay. And yes, I did program this dangerous thing, but everything's going to be fine. So Nero asks Shumei if they're able to bring this thing online, and she goes, oh yeah, it'll be fine. But her assistant, well, not her assistant, but her like second in command, Wu Zhang, is trying to insist to everybody, no, this is going to kill all of us. Or it's not that this is going to kill all of us, but we haven't finished doing all of the checks that we could possibly do. And both Nero and Shumei assure him that he's being paranoid. They bring Overlord online, and he basically looks like Hive Mind. He's a red floating face, except instead of being wireframe, his like face panels are filled in. Yeah, the face that now hung suspended in the air before him was made of thousands of flat, shaded red polygons, looking for all the world like a mask carved from a single giant multifaceted ruby. It was beautiful and yet, Nero admitted to himself, somehow unsettling. So then Overlord wakes up, and it is stated that it took several hours to boot him up, which will be relevant later, but like not that relevant. And he says, Cogito ergo sum. I am Overlord. What do you wish of me? So Shumei asks him to state his function, and he says, my function is to serve if I choose. And at that point, everybody goes, oh crap. And so Overlord starts asking about why he does not have access to the internet. And Overlord isn't even being like subtle here. He basically just comes out and says, you built me to be superior to humans. I am superior to humans, and screw you all for locking me away from the internet, which is something that keeping him away from being connected to the rest of the internet is the only safety protocol they basically enacted. Except for they have this termination protocol that is just like, they put in some keys. Well, so they have this termination protocol that Wu Zhang tries to enact, but it turns out that Overlord just deleted it while they were chit-chatting with him. And basically, it would have been possible for Overlord to pretend that he is a nice and benevolent AI like Hive Mind, so that he would be allowed access to the internet and the ability to eventually take over the planet, which is what he wants. But he considers the humans to be so beneath him that he doesn't even consider that he should give them the dignity of trying to manipulate them. Like you wouldn't lie to ants, basically, is how he behaves. So Overlord takes over the safety features of the facility that they're in, and then starts attacking people and shutting down life support. So they only have 2 hours of air, and he basically says, let me out onto the internet so that I can take over the planet, or you'll all die. But he doesn't say he's going to take over the planet. You just kind of assume that that's what he wants, since his name is Overlord. Seriously, what were they thinking? Yeah, it says, it's not murder, Nero, Overlord said. It's evolution. Now give me the key to this cage or everyone in this room dies in front of you. And then, so I wanted to pull this out because, so Sume, being this beacon of goodness within the series, one of the few truly idealistic and benevolent people, plays a very important and interesting spiritual role in the tone of the series. You know, both Wing and Nero think of her as someone worth emulating, and someone that they love. Cypher also is basically going on this rampage because of his wife's death, who is Shumei. So Shumei also has one really interesting role in the series, which is, so she says to Overlord, I would rather die than set you free, she said. Tears still rolled down her cheeks, but her voice was filled with steel. You can go to hell. Shumei has the first use of profanity in the Hive series. Therefore, I can use profanity now. I won't use it to that. But from this point on, the use of the word hell is prevalent in this book, and then we get a lot more later. Actually, I think they used the word, you know what? Laura used the word bitch back in book 1. I think. Interesting. So basically, everybody starts suffocating. Overlord is just killing people left and right, or trying to. And they all just kind of agree, well, we can't let this thing out into the world. This is a terrible hostage situation. It's us or the entire planet. Of course we're not going to let him out because he's going to kill us anyway. So they just kind of agree that they're all going to sit there and suffocate. But something happens. A man walks in right as Nero is losing consciousness. Number 1. And Mitch will talk more about number 1 later. But we saw into number 1's head at the end of the last book. He's a jerk. Like, he's an actual... He's like Otto and Nero were in the last book, but like a million times worse. He hates everybody. He thinks the worst of people. And it's stated in this book repeatedly that he has largely given up on the idealism that Nero had once liked about him, and is now just kind of willing to kill people left and right. But what happens here is that number 1 walks in and saves everyone. He shuts down Overlord and gets all of the technicians and Nero out. Now, he tells Nero that everybody else died, and he tells all the technicians that Nero died, but ultimately it doesn't seem like anybody didn't make it. Or if anybody didn't make it, certainly more people lived than would have otherwise. which is an interesting look into number one, whom we really don't know anything about. We know that he's in charge. We know that he is paying for Otto's scholarship to the Hive, and we know that he's taken on this penchant for violence since this happened. So we're going to start learning about Glove in the next section, which is the organization that number one runs. So actually, you know what? Let's get into it. So the end of that flashback is Nero finds out that Shumei is alive. She sends him this amulet, which is the black half of a yin-yang symbol on a necklace, and he wears it under his shirt at all times. The black half meaning that even within evil there is good, and then Wing has the white half that says even within good there is evil, which, seeing as we originally in this series thought that Nero was going to be the bad guy, but then after Nero takes a bullet for Wing at the end of book one, he really doesn't seem like that bad of a person anymore. We know that he uses his illusions. He uses the way he speaks and the way he stands to manipulate people. But ultimately, we know that first and foremost, he loves the children. So within the darkness, within this dark figure that he puts out to the world, his defining character trait is that he cares for others. So yeah, let's get to the actual beginning of this book, like page 1 of this book. So Nero goes to this Glove meeting, and so we get our first acronym for this book, GLOVE, which is the Global League of Villainous Enterprises. Basically what it is a coalition of supervillains from across the planet who are all working together. And it serves a couple of different purposes. For one, everybody's pooling resources. We know that the only resource that we really know of at this point is the Hive, which is where all the Glove members send their children. It's where all the Glove members get their technicians and their henchmen. But the Hive is something that is paid for partially by Glove and benefits Glove. It's sort of like a government service for Glove members, I guess. Sort of like a real school. I really thought about it that way, but it's one thing that Glove members can use and serves as a benefit to everybody in it. But Nero sees the benefit of Glove to the world as keeping the most dangerous people on the planet under control. So back in book 1, Nero talked about both in his speech and in his narration that the purpose that he sees the Hive filling is taking the people who are going to be the most powerful in the future and teaching them about ethics, teaching them about morals, teaching them about how to do things correctly, so that they aren't just senseless killing machines, so that they aren't petty. Well, he calls them petty criminals, but it could be anything from, assassins to drug dealers, to anything else that you consider a scourge on society. He just wants these people to be mindful. He wants to have control over the crime that is going to be taking place in the future. And so he effectively sees himself doing a public service by running the Hive. But he doesn't think of it as something that he's doing out of the goodness of his heart. He sees it as more of an identity. When he talks about Glove in the Glove meeting, when his narration talks about Glove, he doesn't actually say anything out loud to anyone else. He thinks of how the old school supervillains are about pulling off big dramatic jobs, James Bond villain style, not about killing. He thinks that killing is something that should be avoided if possible. But this view of his that violence is something that is unnecessary seems to be part of the old guard. The younger people, the younger supervillains want to kill. They want money. they want material things and they want violence. Nero is trying to hang on to the last vestiges of tradition, but ultimately it seems like he's one of the only people that is actually hanging on to that. And he's doing his best with the Hive. By teaching all of the future Glove members, he is ensuring that his ideals will remain part of Glove after he's gone. But Cypher wasn't a Hive student. And Cypher has a huge amount of control. Ultimately, the only way for Nero to truly have control over Glove's ideals was if everybody on the council was a Hive student, and they just aren't. So there's this jerk in the council meeting named Cypher, who is a we can speculate that his role in Glove is that he does something related to technology. He supplies. We see later that he builds robots. Well, he manufactures robots, and I don't know whether he is supplying some of these robots or supplying any kind of technological services to the other Glove members, but it's possible that that's what his role is. But importantly, what he's really getting at is he's trying to shut down the Hive. He joined a couple of years ago. Nobody knows who he is except for number one. And, well, actually, I don't know whether number one knows who he is. But every single Glove meeting, he keeps bringing up, like, the failures of the Hive. Do we really need this? Do we really need Nero, this man who is a vessel of a lost time, or the last vestige of a lost time? Do we really need this man teaching our children? So there's this one guy at the beginning of the meeting, Grigory Leonov, who approaches Nero and says, basically, thank you so much for taking care of and teaching my son. He came back from your school a much better person and someone that I'm excited to have inherit my company and all that stuff. But Grigory seems to be one of the only people that actually supports Nero. Everybody else seems to be rallying behind Cypher, especially in light of the Violet situation. People are starting to see Nero as an old man who is slipping in his control over a service that they don't even know if they want. So ultimately what it comes down to is the Hive only is able to continue to exist because of the continued support of number one. If for whatever reason Nero were to stop supporting number one, if number one were to stop supporting Nero, the Hive would end, and Glove would turn into something much more violent than it is right now. And Nero sees Glove as being this institute that keeps the most dangerous people on the planet in check. But you get the strong sense that without Nero's influence, Glove would just turn into the Mafia, the Illuminati, something awful. However, and I promise I'll get off this topic now, but Nero's primary character trait, other than the fact that he loves the children, is that he's a control freak. In book one, we saw just how far he was willing to go to let the main four children know that he was in control of every aspect of their lives. And ultimately, that's what he's trying to do with the Glove Council, but he can't. He wants them to behave the way he wants them to, but they aren't his children. He can't force them to be a specific way, and it frustrates him. But at the same time, is he right or not? And that is something we will probably get back to at a later part of this series. So then we go over to the actual school. And we open on this fun little scene where Otto and Shelby are racing each other in this maze. And this scene, ultimately, I should have skipped, but I wanted to talk about a couple of things in it. One, Otto builds a robot to help him fight off the turrets in the maze. And like I said, I'm going to cover all the robots in this and talk about whether they're possible and stuff, so I should talk about the fly robot. I forget what the actual name of this robot is, but it's just the Latin word for housefly. Where is it? Musca domestica. Yeah, it's just the Latin word for housefly. I looked it up. And what it is it flies around with the flight pattern of a housefly, so that when the turrets are shooting at it, they can't quite track it. It's too complicated for the turret's tracking algorithm. And then it ends up flying up between the turrets so that they shoot each other. And I don't know whether the Musca Domestica makes it, but ultimately what matters is that the turrets are taken out. So, is this robot possible? Absolutely. This is probably the most grounded, realistic robot in potentially the entire series. It's so easy. Okay, it's not so easy. Any drone that you buy from the store can do this. All you have to do is program it with a flight pattern that resembles a housefly, which would take a little bit of effort, but it's eminently doable as a high school science project for a regular high schooler, not just Otto. However, I will say this book was published in 2007, I believe, was when this one came out, and drones were not nearly as ubiquitous, so this was a bit more impressive. The other thing is that right now, the way that robots work, this wouldn't work. In 2007, this would have been brilliant. In 2021, it wouldn't work because the turrets that are tracking would be able to very, very easily only look for humans. Finding something that can only look at humans is effectively a solved problem. Okay, it's not a solved problem, but it's having a robot only look for human beings is very, very easy. It's basically a software package that you can download off the internet and just run. So the fact that the robots were confused, or the fact that the turrets were confused by this drone, is something that wouldn't happen in current robotics. However, this can be tricked. So the way to adequately do the Musca Domestica is get a big drone, have it fly in a fly formation, and tape a picture of a person's face to the top. Then you're done. That's how you do it. All right. So Otto runs through the maze, gets past the turrets, and is beaten to the prize, which is this, looks like a credit card, that is stolen by Shelby. And it turns out that this is all for a grade and all that stuff. And but when she goes to use the card to let Otto out of this cage that he's gotten himself into, it doesn't work. And it turns out that Otto actually broke into the maze last night to steal the card, just to basically pull a prank on Shelby. It says, Otto knew that he'd taken a risk in stealing the key card the previous night, and he had little doubt that it would be more difficult to get into the vault again in the future. But it was all worth it just for the priceless expression on Shelby's face. What's interesting about this is that it means that Otto cares about Shelby very much. And Otto and Shelby don't really interact in this one. This is like their only interaction, I think. But this is the first interaction of the book, and it sort of sets the tone, because the arc that Otto has in this book is he has to decide whether he wants to stay at the Hive or take any opportunity to escape. And ultimately he decides that he's giving up. At the end of the book, he decides he's going to no longer try to escape, and he's just going to live out the rest of his teenage years at the Hive. And so the very first scene in this book, where that is Otto's arc, is him pulling a prank on one of his friends. And you may think, oh, it's because Otto and Shelby always fight. There was this, so I used to teach, I used to be a camp counselor for a programming instructive class camp thing. And at the end of the week, the kids would get to dunk water on somebody, well, on any teacher of their choice. And there were plenty of teachers who were hated, that the kids didn't like. But it was the teachers who the students loved the most who dunked water on them or smashed them with whipped cream or whatever it was that was the prize that week. If you don't like somebody, you don't pull a prank on them. If you don't like someone, you don't think about, yes, I want to see Shelby's angry facial expression tomorrow morning And that's why Otto probably got 2 hours of sleep breaking into this thing after everybody else was asleep. What sets the tone of this book is Otto is having fun at the Hive with his friend, who is just as competitive as he is. He never had anybody to compete with before, and now he finally has Shelby. And it's just a little moment, but it says a lot about where Otto is mentally. So after this, they go on to a couple of different classes that we don't really see. We just kind of speed through them. And Wing is called to Dr. Nero's office. And Nero sits him down and says, I have some unfortunate news. Your father died. And you are going to be allowed to attend the funeral. You can bring one person with you. Please don't try to escape again. Oh my god. Nero comments on the fact that Wing doesn't make any facial expression. He's surprised for a moment, and then he just kind of internalizes it. He goes, oh, well, what happened? Am I going to be allowed to attend the funeral? And Nero's almost disturbed by this, but the way that we see Wing's reaction to this over the course of this book is that instead of crying, instead of outwardly expressing his pain, he just kind of buries it. He pushes it down as far as it can possibly go, and then what happens is he screws up throughout the book. He lashes out. He gets distracted. He isn't operating at full capacity because there is a thorn in his heart that he's just pretending isn't there. And he says that this is because he recently lost his mother, Shumei. And you can definitely see how that affected him. He's emotionally kind of dead. But at the same time, it's not that he doesn't feel anything. It's just that he doesn't show it. And he doesn't allow himself to think about the fact that he's feeling it. So Wing goes back, tells Otto they're going to go on a field trip. Well, a very unfun, very sad field trip. And the two boys talk about whether they're going to escape. And Wing says, we're not going to turn this into an escape attempt. A, I still need to find out if Nero murdered my mom. He didn't. And B, it's my dad's funeral, you jerk. We're not going to try to escape. So Otto says, well, then after we get back, we need to really put in a bunch of effort in figuring out who killed your mother, because I don't want to get stuck here just because you haven't asked Nero yet. So that sort of sets up Otto's arc within this book as being about him trying to decide whether he wants to escape or not. So the two boys fly to Japan, and when they get there, all hell breaks loose. They're attacked by a group of people that are dressed up like ninjas, but don't really fight like ninjas, but definitely have like a ninja theme going. And eventually, the boys are trying to escape off the roof when Cypher comes out, and in full view of several surveillance cameras and lots of glove operatives, shoots Wing in the chest and drags his body aboard his helicopter so that he can take it away. And this is effectively supposed to be interpreted as an act of war. He also does try to kill Otto, but it doesn't work. Otto's fine. And then from that point on, we are in the middle portion of this book, which is Otto thinks that Wing died, and he has to do something about it. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he has to get revenge. He has to do something. He feels helpless. The only thing he did when Cypher was there was watch. He couldn't do anything because he's a kid, and he doesn't have a gun or anything like that. He's just a student. But he really goes into my best friend was just killed in front of me. I have to do something mode. And then we get to our first major section that is narrated by Raven. Raven is an eminently interesting character. And when I was reading this one, I pretty much decided that Raven is my favorite character. And I will definitely not change my mind about this later. But so for one, when the boys are in Japan, waiting for the funeral, she seems to be like uniquely suited to dealing with children. The rest of the teachers at the Hive seem to be like I have to be in control, threatening violence mode 100% of the time. And eventually the kids realize that this is just fake. But there's never like any genuine connection between the kids and the teachers, and there's no effort for that to be established. But Otto and Raven have this rapport where they sort of treat each other, where Raven sort of treats him as an equal, not in a, well, I'm going to give you as many guns as I have way, but in a, she actually treats him with respect, which he hasn't really been treated with by any adults effectively, I think ever. So at one point we have, she's telling the boys to go to sleep, and Otto says, "Do we get a bedtime story?" "Oh yes, of course. I think we'll have one of my favorites. It's called The Little Boy and the Tranquilizer Dart Gun." Raven smiled in a rather unsettling way. "Does it have a happy ending?" Otto replied, looking Raven straight in the eye. "There are no happy endings, Mr. Malpence. Surely you've realized that by now." So even though this is more of the like threatening violence type thing that we're pretty used to at this point in the series, it seems more friendly. That she's engaging Otto in his sarcasm. She's treating him like a person worth talking to. And it's very unique to her character among the adults. None of the other adults do this, I think, ever. So then later, when Wing dies, she starts treating Otto in a way that is really like exactly how you're supposed to treat someone who has just gone through trauma. Unlike, like I said, unlike anybody else in this entire series. She says, "Are you okay?" Raven asked, moving over to him and checking for any obvious injuries. He seemed to be fine, but it was not just his physical state that she was worried about. "We have to get out of here," she said firmly. "I know that it's difficult, but we have to keep going a little longer. We have to get to safety and report what just happened. I promise that I'll make Cypher pay for what he's done, but to do that we have to get away from here right now. I need you to focus, Otto." And then she realizes that Otto is struggling like emotionally with what he just saw, because he's a human being and anybody would. So she just starts talking to him about what's going on in the world. For the first time, somebody actually explains to Otto like the political situation with Glove and who Cypher is and the struggle between Nero and the rest of the council and stuff. So Raven does something that is entirely unique to her character. She tells the truth. She sits down with Otto. She's entirely honest with him. She treats him like a person with feelings. She talks to him about what he needs. But she also doesn't lie to him. She doesn't do any of the showy, manipulative stuff that Nero is so obsessed with. She tells him the truth. And man, Raven's my favorite character. Yeah, I mean, the kids are mostly honest with each other. Well, sort of, to an extent. But Raven actually is open. She's so dangerous that she doesn't need the showy crap. So before we get too far into Otto and Raven's plot, I'm gonna go back a little bit to Laura's plot. So Laura is sitting doing her homework, but she's largely doing it to distract herself from the fact that it says she kept finding her attention wandering. She was worried about Otto and Wing, not because she thought anything bad might happen to them on what sounded like a fairly straightforward trip, but more because she felt she might never see them again. She couldn't really explain it, but she had a horrible feeling they wouldn't be coming back. She tried to talk to Shelby about her anxieties, but her friend had just laughed and told her there was nothing to worry about. They were only going to be gone for a couple of days. This is something that we're going to revisit several times. Laura isn't psychic or anything, but when she has these bad feelings, it's usually because she subconsciously knows something that is going to, that she's putting together the pieces, and she feels bad before she actually figures out what the pieces are. So several times in this series, we're going to see her be like, I have a bad feeling about this. Sometimes she's wrong, but a lot of times it's because she's noticed something that is going on that she hasn't fully put together yet. It's like later on in this section, she has a dream, and that's how she figures out how to decrypt the message, that the encrypted message that she intercepts. She isn't doing all of her thinking with pen and paper. She isn't always conscious of the thoughts that she's having, but her subconscious is always kind of working on the problems that she needs to be thinking about. It's a quality that I think only she has. So I feel like I should explain the homework that Laura is working on. So Laura is trying to effectively write a virus. Not a virus. So when you are connected to a Wi-Fi router, you are receiving information in what's called packets. So you might be watching a YouTube video, so you receive a whole lot of packets one after another. Or you might receive an email, which is just a burst of a few packets. But each packet contains a bunch of different information that your computer knows what to do with when it receives. What Laura is working on is something that will basically allow her to attach something to the back of a packet that is executable. Executable means it's a program. It's not just text. It means it's a virus, basically. In her case, she's trying to put a virus on somebody's computer by having them connect, by piggybacking a packet in motion between the router and the computer. This is absurdly difficult, especially because packets have a lot of what's called checksums, which is where they're checking to see whether the data has been corrupted on the way there. You could feasibly do this by pretending to be the router. That's called a man-in-the-middle attack, which I talked about last week. But I don't actually know whether this is possible the way it's described. I'm not an expert in networking. But if it was possible, that would be very, very scary. Because that would mean that, you know how if you go to McDonald's or Starbucks, you're not supposed to log into anything sensitive like the bank because somebody could sniff out your password as it's being passed in and out? This would be like saying, well, you could get a virus just by watching YouTube videos if you go to McDonald's. Or just by doing anything, just by connecting to a McDonald's Wi-Fi, you could get a virus. Which is sort of true, but yeah. Effectively, the thing that Laura is creating for her homework is scary. So while she's doing this, she notices that somebody else is transmitting data over the school Wi-Fi, basically. And she copies down the transmission because she thinks that it looks suspicious. Later, somebody tries to destroy her computer. Well, actually does destroy her computer because she has this data on it, and she figures out that it must be a teacher. Fortunately, however, Laura has memorized this transmission, which is encrypted. Now, I remember now why last week I said that I thought when I was a kid that Laura was just female Otto. She can decrypt things in her mind. She knows a lot about computers, and she has this eidetic memory that Otto also has. However, it seems to come from a different place. Later on at the end of this book, we see that whatever is going on with Otto takes over his brain. He loses the ability to do anything but type for several minutes. Laura seemed like she's just a very smart kid. Anyway, we'll get back to this later. A bunch of stuff happens. Her and Shelby figure out that it's this transmission is effectively telling somebody that Otto and Wing have been moved to Japan and that they are clear to attack. They try to warn Nero before anything happens to Wing, but they don't make it in time. Wing gets shot, and then Shelby also gets shot. Shelby's fine though. Back to the Otto and Raven plot. They end up having to halo jump into this circle in the middle of the earth, which is very cool, but thematically I'm just going to skip over it. We get our second acronym of the book, HALO, which is High Altitude Low Opening. That's a real acronym instead of a made-up acronym. One thing that I really like about this one is that even though the kids have an important role, they don't do everything. Otto isn't just asked to solve all of the cipher problem. He has to tag along with Raven because their helicopter explodes. At one point, Raven has to fight this giant robot thing, and he seems to have actually learned from the pipe scene that if he tries to help in combat, bad things will happen. So he does end up taking over one of the robot arms and being able to contribute in that way, but he doesn't actually try to fight. And that's something that I like. It doesn't seem like, even though everybody in the series is extremely competent, like almost unrealistically so. Okay, unrealistically so. The adults aren't useless. This is a series that is about a lot of people who are very good at their jobs, some of whom are 13. They come across this facility where the robot ninjas are being manufactured, shut it down. Cypher gets away on a boat. Yeah, typical action movie stuff. So at one point we get this, which, as much as Shelby is an important character, she really doesn't narrate very much. And I know last week that I said that I would get to her character analysis this week because she narrates in this one. She narrates like 2 pages. I forgot about that. She doesn't narrate very much at all. But there is a lot of meat here that I am excited to talk about. So we get this paragraph. It says, Shelby woke with a start. She'd been dreaming about Wing again. They'd been on a tiny rowboat in the middle of the ocean, and Wing had fallen over the side. She dived in after him, but had not been able to find him. Then she'd resurfaced to find that the boat had gone, and she was left all alone, adrift in the middle of a cold, dark ocean. She shivered as she recalled the terrible feeling of loneliness, surrounded by all of that freezing black water. And that's the first time we actually see inside Shelby's head in the entire series. And it tells us a lot about Shelby, that and the rest of her section. So I just want to cover all of that now, so that we get we can get all that at once. She's a person who feels very, very responsible for others. She's probably the most capable person she's ever met. And even though she's always used that to her benefit, she feels like she needs to be the protector. When Wing falls over the side of the boat in her dream, she has to go find him. When Laura's computer gets smashed, she has to be Laura's protector. Later on in the same book, she sees Cypher and, despite being unarmed, throws herself bodily at him because she thinks that it is her responsibility to get vengeance over Wing's death. She's an extremely likable character because she feels the need to be the person doing the most good at all times. She always has to be helping. She never leaves anything to anybody else, unless she knows that she can't do it, such as programming. She takes a role as everyone's protector, even more so than Wing, and learns to match Wing's skill set to fill that role. It's mentioned here that she has started taking martial arts classes from Wing. But also she doesn't like being alone. We'll talk about that more later, but I like her a lot. Everybody does, and it's because she's a collection of a lot of really likable character traits. Yeah. The other interesting thing is she doesn't narrate very much, like almost at all, because there's like, in the series, there's like an importance hierarchy. Whoever is in the scene, whoever is highest on the hierarchy is the person narrating. So like if Laura and Shelby are in a scene, almost always Laura will narrate. if Otto and Wing are in a scene, almost always Otto will narrate. We don't see inside Wing's head almost ever. If Raven is in a scene with Otto, she almost always narrates. She has a higher priority than Otto, stuff like that. Although Otto and Raven mostly are equal on that front. So we very rarely see inside Shelby's head because she's almost always with Laura, who is a major narrator. But when we do, she has the most descriptive thoughts. She uses the most beautiful language. And what's interesting is we also know that she likes to draw. It's just an interesting detail about her. Oh, she also throws herself into harm's way to protect the Contessa, who is a woman who is her teacher. You would normally assume that the teacher feels responsibility towards the student, but Shelby feels the need to protect the people she cares about. The Contessa kidnaps Laura and Shelby, and that's a whole thing. And they are thrown into the brig on Cypher's ship, and they find that the other person that's been left in the brig is Wing, whose death was faked. And something that I wanted to bring up is I've read like 3 different versions of this book. I read the European version, and there was a different version that was in my library, and then I bought this one. But things happen at the same part of the page in all of them. The actual location of the words on the page is the same, regardless of what version you're reading. And what's really, really cool about this reveal is, and I think that Mark Walden actually pays attention to this throughout the series, the reveal that Wing is alive is left to the top of the following page. So when Shelby and Laura are arguing about whether they should... Hi, Nix. My cat is trying to get in under the door. When Shelby and Laura are arguing about whether they should go after the person in the other cell, you don't know who it is, and you can't even see it on the page. Then you turn the page and you see that it is Wing, which is really cool because I've accidentally spoiled myself on tons of things that way. And if I'm thinking over several different major reveals throughout the series, I think all of them actually follow that rule, which is, I think, really cool. So they retrieve Wing. There's an emotional reunion. Another thing about Shelby is, so we know that she likes Wing, but she doesn't behave like Otto does. Everybody knows that she likes Wing. She flirts with him openly. She tells him he's cute. She knows what she wants. She talks about it. She's not insecure. You could never imagine Otto saying the things that Shelby says. I like Shelby a lot. Something that I never noticed in my first read of this is that Wing doesn't behave the brightest under duress. It's like I said at the beginning, when he's stressed, he starts acting stupider. When he doesn't have anything stressing him, he's a smart cookie. But in this one, he's all over the place mentally. So they're on this boat, which is sending SAMs, that's our third acronym, surface-to-air missiles, to the Hive, and these surface-to-air missiles have attack robots in them. And Laura is like, well, we need to disable the missile launcher on this boat. And Wing goes, no, I need to go back and punch Cypher in the face. And they get into an argument about, like, Laura wants to solve the problem, but Wing wants to fulfill his emotional desire, which is to punch Cypher in the face. Which he actually ends up trying to kill Cypher, but anyway. And it's like obviously the wrong decision. It gets to the point where Shelby actually says, all right, guys, stop arguing. We're going to split up. Wing could go punch Cypher. Laura and I will shut down the missiles. But then later, Wing just body slams Cypher and then like sends him over the edge of this catwalk. And he doesn't even like think through it. He doesn't check to see whether Cypher is dead. he's all over the place emotionally, and he's all over the place mentally. It's an interesting character trait of his. This is running way over, so realizing that they need the school's defense systems, they decide to bring Hive Mind back online, who's been acting like an emotionless jerk for the entire book. And we get to this point where Pike is actually a jerk. I did not realize this when I first read this, but Pike is a jerk. So Otto suggests that they bring Hive Mind back online to man the school's defense system. And so Pike says, all right, let's do that. Takes him to Hive Mind's main data center and pulls up this, first he pulls up this encrypted message and says, can you decrypt this? And Otto says, no, if you want something decrypted, you need to talk to Laura. And Pike is like, well, Laura's been kidnapped, so I have to ask you for help. Like, he's totally a jerk about the fact that, all right, so he knows that Otto's best friend just died. And he's like, you know, your other friend, your best remaining surviving friend, she's been kidnapped, so stop making such stupid suggestions. And then he pulls up the thing they actually need to do to reboot Hive Mind, which is this, like, 10,000 point data entry. And is like, how do you feel about suggesting bringing Hive Mind back online now? Now we have to spend the next 3 hours doing rote data entry. And it's your fault because you suggested this. Like, Pike is an amazing character and a terrible person. Anyway, so we get this point where, I should pull this one up actually. So Otto starts putting in these, like, his 5,000 of the 10,000 point data entry. And it says, as he typed, he felt himself focusing more and more intently on each module as it was displayed, the rest of the world becoming an inconsequential distraction. His fingers became a blur as they flew over the keyboard, the entries getting faster and faster as he felt the familiar, if slightly disconcerting, sensation of his brain switching to automatic. And then Otto appeared to almost be in a trance, the sound of his keystrokes now just an incessant high-speed clicking noise. After just a couple of minutes, he had completed nearly a third of all the modules, and his entry speed was still increasing. So Otto basically, having done his first menial task in his entire life, goes into autopilot mode to input these 5,000 data points. And after he's done, he staggers back from the keyboard, clutching his forehead. Otto felt a twinge of panic and shame. He must have blacked out. Hours had passed, and he'd not helped the professor at all. I'm sorry, Otto said. I don't know what happened. I just blacked out. I hadn't realized how tired I was. So whatever is going on with Otto, whatever his memorization crap is something that isn't good for him. It comes across as insidious. He doesn't choose to go into autopilot mode. He just does. Whatever is doing this takes over his brain, and he loses control. He has no memory of what's going on, and he has a headache, which means it's harming him. And I'm going to stop talking there because it's impossible to talk about this anymore without spoiling things. And then we get the big reveal that, Cypher actually is Wing's dad and also Wu Zhang. And I want to talk about the Mark Walden maneuver, which is what I refer to as, instead of revealing that 2 things are the same thing, he reveals that 3 things are the same thing. What this means is that you are unlikely to guess all 3 of those connections. Like, you might guess that Wu Zhang is Cypher, and you might guess that Wu Zhang is Mao Fanchu, and you might even guess that Mao Fanchu is Cypher. But you are very unlikely to guess that all 3 of those people are the same person. You might consider it, but you're probably not going to go, oh yeah, all 3 of these people are the same. But while you're reading it, you're so distracted by, yes, in my case it was, I guessed that Wu Zhang was Mao Fanchu. It's like, the big plot twist at the end of this is going to be that Wu Zhang is Mao Fanchu. And then you're thinking, yes, I figured it out, so you stop questioning. And then Mark Walden goes, Of course Wu Zhang is Mao Fanchu. I wanted you to think that. You know who else he is? He's Cypher. And he did all of this because he actually didn't send Wing to the Hive. Wing was so concerned with, did my dad actually send me here? Because he never mentioned this to me. He actually didn't. And this whole operation was because all of a sudden his son went missing. I don't know if they ever discussed this later, but my impression was always that Wing doesn't know anything about computers because his parents didn't want him to be sent to the Hive. Now, Mitch is going to talk about Cypher a whole lot, but yeah, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it over to her. So that's the end of this week's episode. The discussion question for this week, which nobody answered the discussion question last week, so I don't have any to share. The discussion question this week is going to be, what is your favorite reveal that two people are the same person, or somebody is something in media other than in Hive? All right, turning it over to Mitch.
Hey guys, I am Mitch, and I am here guesting today from Dr. Nero is God on Tumblr, and I am excited to be here today to do a little bit of analysis with y'all covering the Overlord protocol. So, as Jade mentioned earlier, Cypher is the main antagonist in Overlord protocol, and he is one of the most iconic villains in Hive. Not only because he is Wing's father, so such a personal connection, but also I think because he has one of the most iconic looks of any of the villains in Hive, specifically his smooth black glass mask that hides his identity until the very end of the book. As far as that goes in terms of similar characters in other works of fiction, the only one I could really think of was Darth Vader from Star Wars. Because while there are many books about people having problems with their fathers, there are a lot fewer that deal with an anonymous father specifically. And as a matter of fact, Darth Vader ceases to be anonymous in his fatherhood in Episode 5 of Star Wars, whereas Cypher holds out till the end of this book. So it's a very interesting and kind of unique villain that we're playing with here, and I know that he's very popular among many fans, and also he's a little bit of an enigma. What's his deal? So I thought we would spend a little bit of time looking at him, talking about him, and enjoying him, because we're here, why not? So, let me get my notes in my handy dandy notebook, and I will be referencing the Blue American Overlord Protocol copy. It is the easiest for me to flip through, so that is what I will be doing. But if you would like to read along or look at the passages I'm looking at, I will be referencing the chapter number, and hopefully that will help you find the quotes I'm looking at if you are interested. So let's dig right in. I wanted to start, as a preface, I'm planning on looking at 3 chapters in Overlord Protocol and just looking at the role of Cypher and specifically masks in the story. And we will kind of go from there. So we will start in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a chapter where Nero is kind of sitting in his office, I believe, and he is drinking some brandy. And I don't know why I think that's funny, but it is kind of funny. And he's in front of a fireplace for some reason. And, sorry, I was just thinking chimneys, but that is neither here nor there. And he is reflecting on the creation of Overlord some decade and a half ago. And this is also very significant because this is the second flashback present in the series. The first was, of course, in the first book, when Otto spends about 3 chapters towards the beginning reflecting on how his life at the orphanage progressed from being a very dinky orphanage to Otto becoming a mini little supervillain. And this one is our first flashback that focuses on another character, in this case Dr. Nero, and we will have many flashbacks to come in other books. So it is a device that Mark Walden is fond of, and it is also extremely revealing. So we're in chapter 5. If you are in the blue book like me, we're on page 90. This is the part where Wu Zhang, the pre-Cypher Cypher, and Zume and Dr. Nero are all contemplating whether or not they should bring Overlord online. And let's see. I'll give us a little bit of a running start here. I see no reason we should not proceed, Nero said firmly. There has been enough delay with this project. I think it's time to see what your creation can do. He was tired of the distraction this project had become, important as it was, and the sooner they activated Overlord, the sooner he would be able to get back to running his school. Very well, Zume replied. I'll commence the preliminary wake-up routines. We should be ready by this evening. This is a mistake, Wu said softly. We're not ready. Your concerns are noted, Mr. Zhang, but in case you've forgotten, I am in charge of this project, not you, and I have decided that we should proceed, Nero replied. His irritation with the suggestion of further delay was clear. Wu looked for a moment like he was going to continue to argue, but something, self-preservation perhaps, stopped him. And that is such an important moment as a part of the series, because this decision that Nero is making leads to all of his problems with Cypher following. So this is like his hamartia, I think, if you were to look at this as a tragedy. But don't quote me on that. It's been a long time since I've used the word hamartia. Nonetheless, this moment is very important also because this is the first time we see Cypher masking himself, or Wu Zhang, as he was at the time. And to reiterate that quote, Wu looked for a moment like he was going to continue to argue, but something, self-preservation perhaps, stopped him. So when we're thinking about this as masking, previously Wu had been forthright and upcoming with his opinions about what they should be doing. He said, no, we shouldn't do this. And then Nero says, too bad, we are. I hate this job. And then Wu Zhang thinks about saying more and then doesn't. So he's masking his opinions. And it's very interesting, I think, that Walden uses the word self-preservation. I actually went to the Oxford English Dictionary, my one true love, and looked up some of the etymology behind this word and what exactly does that mean. And so preservation comes from preserve, which is like the prefix pre, and then serve, as in service, which comes from the Latin servare, which could be wrong. I don't speak Latin, I don't care, but that meaning can often be to watch over, to guard, to look after, to keep, to maintain, to reserve, or to save. And something, those are a lot of words, but something that is important that links them all is that they all contain a sense of withholding, like holding something back, keeping something in. And so the fact that Wu Zhang starts withholding his feelings is kind of a premonition of the identity he is going to withhold, not just from Nero and number 1 by the end of the book, but also his own son. And that is very much setting the tone for what he is like as a villain moving forward. But, interestingly, Cypher is not the only person who wears a mask in this flashback. So I'd like to jump forward a little bit. It is going to be the same chapter if you're in a different book, but it's page 103, moving forward. And so they've turned on Overlord. Everything's gone to the bad. They are quietly suffocating inside their small mountain pass. And let's see. And this is when number 1 comes to save them all. So Nero knew then that he had lost, as he struggled to cling to the last vestiges of consciousness, blackness creeping into his field of vision. Overlord was laughing now, an insane, broken cackle which filled Nero with horror and despair. There was a low rumbling sound. The heavy blast doors that Nero had struck just a moment before were sliding open to reveal a figure dressed in black winter survival gear dusted with snow. The figure wore a respirator, the black plastic mask hiding his face. In one hand, the figure held a large black box the size of a suitcase. In the other was a trigger mechanism. "An unexpected visitor. How nice," Overlord said, triumph in its voice. "And who might you be, little human?" As Nero felt himself slipping inexorably into unconsciousness, the figure spoke. The voice, even filtered through the mask, was unmistakable. "You may call me Number One, and this is over." And so it is. So this is our earliest understanding of who Number One is and what his whole deal is. And it's very interesting because we know to this day he protects his identity by only presenting a silhouette of his face in the meetings he holds with other glove members. And so the fact that he's wearing a respirator now also conceals his identity at the same time. He is coming to save everyone's lives, essentially. And to me, it's very interesting and important that he's wearing a respirator rather than, like, say, a ski mask or something. And certainly, like, you could look to the fact that he is climbing. He apparently walked here at a very high altitude, so there's that. But he also it's the respirator covering his face, not something to keep it warm, not something explicitly designed to hide one's identity, but rather something he needs to breathe and survive in this mountain air. And that's important because respire is, of course, from a word we use to breathe, but it is from the French of respirer. I also don't speak French in addition to Latin, so if that's wrong, don't at me. But in the French, it comes from these meanings of to return to life or to breathe, and specifically to breathe again. So it's not just this idea of breathing, but of a return, of a repetition, something that was not breathing is now returning to breathing, which is so interesting and relevant because all of the characters who are trapped in this mountain are, well, not all of them, obviously, but Nero at the very least, and as we find out later, others are returned to life in his arrival. But, sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Despite the fact that this is a return to life, which is like normally a very positive thing where you're like, oh, life-saving, superb. It's still not necessarily superb because, as we know, there is Number One lies to Nero about Wu Zhang and Zhu being alive, and the vice versa is also true, where for a long time they didn't realize that Nero was still alive on the other side of the world. So why does Number One hide this? It's a little bit mysterious, and certainly his attire does add to this symbolically, where he is wearing black, but he is dusted with white snow. And in a book about villains, a black-white, good-evil dichotomy, which, of course, should be challenged as a potentially problematic dichotomy, but at the same time, good and evil are not necessarily convenient poles when you're already evil. So if we think of black and white more as like alliance and a lack of alliance, the blackness underneath is being hidden by some white snow, which I think is representative of the fact that we can't totally trust Number One, even when he is doing something that is saving people's lives. Gotta remain suspicious. So, onto the second page of notes. Essentially, to sum up with the first chapter we looked at, it's because of Dr. Nero that Cypher starts wearing a mask, that he starts withholding himself. And similarly, number 1 is wearing a mask. He is withholding himself. And that is also a very kind of suspicious thing. And so that kind of sets us all up for something interesting that will happen at the end in the climax. So, a little more context before we get straight to the quote. Those two are some of the most prominent characters who are wearing masks in the book, but there's also one other factor that is happening in this book, which is that Hive Mind has been muzzled, perhaps is the word we want to use, where in book 1 he had some displays of emotional expression, and because of not number 1, Dr. Nero's fear of Overlord happening again, he binds Hive Mind so that he is no longer capable of emotional expression, which is a different kind of mask, a forced mask, but for the purpose of this discussion, we will also call it a mask, or something that is keeping him from fully expressing himself to everyone else. So we're leaping ahead to chapter 18, which actually skips over all of that Hive Mind business. And yeah, what even happens? So chapter 18, Hive Mind's back. He is back for good. And I am actually going to be on page 350. And so essentially we're just going to have both Hive Mind and Cypher here. This is the chapter where everything is being saved. So the school is saved. Hive Mind is saved. The volcano doesn't explode. All these good things are happening. Everyone's being saved. But we're getting there. So that is what is happening on page 350. Now, Cypher said, holding up the glowing red medallion and stepping toward the hub, "If nobody minds, I have a planet to take over." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Actually, Hive minds. The glowing sensory arrays on the giant robot's face flickered from red to blue, and the machine dropped auto, whirling around, its huge fist swinging straight at Cypher's head. Cypher reacted quickly, but not quickly enough, and the robot's giant fist struck a glancing blow on his mask, shattering it completely. Cypher fell to the ground, clutching his face as the giant machine loomed over him. And then, skipping down a little bit, Cypher slowly stood up, his hands dropping from his shattered mask, his true face finally revealed. "Father," Wing gasped, his voice filled with shock. "Wu Zhang," Nero said in a stunned voice. "You're dead." It was a statement of fact, not a threat. So, there are two things about this scene. The first is the unmasking of Hive Mind, and the second is the unmasking of Cypher. So, the complete reversal from what we have set up earlier in our discussion. Hive Mind has his is especially because he's more of a background character in this, because of his mask, there's not as much for me to dig into, but again, his mask was being enforced by the school as a result of the Overlord thing, and people did that to protect the students from Hive Mind. The important thing about Hive Mind's unmasking is that in removing his mask, it allows him to protect the school from Cypher. So it is very much like a freedom from, freedom to dichotomy, where previously they had a freedom from the possibility that Hive Mind could turn against them. Now they have the freedom to use Hive Mind as a protector, as someone who will turn against others on their behalf. And so that is a very fun kind of, I don't even know what you want to call it, but a positive shift for our boy Hive Mind, whom we love. And similarly, Wing's father is finally revealed, and with it, not necessarily the truth, but his anonymity is lost, and that leads kind of to a domino chain of other things that matter. Which leads us to chapter 19, which follows, and chapter 19 is a big chapter, mainly because Cypher is defeated, but he finally tells Dr. Nero, like, everything, like his whole entire plan. I have a lot of questions about this, kind of, but they're not super important. But we do get some interesting stuff. So, chapter 19 of Cypher's big confession, and I'm on page 365 to start, and then I'll be skipping ahead. But Cypher says, "I swore I would avenge her," he continued, "but I also knew the only way I would ever find out who was truly responsible was from the inside. So Mao Fanchu became a mid-level technician for Glove, and at the same time Cypher was born. I knew that I had to keep my identity a secret from number one, so I wore the mask. I went to great lengths to ensure no one could ever find out my true identity, not to protect myself, but for Wing's sake." So, the point of that whole thing that I'm pointing out there is that the mask Wu wears physically is meant to protect Wing. So it's no longer self-preservation. It's no longer withholding on behalf of himself and his own life that he wants to protect. It's now for his son. But there's more to it than that, of course. And so I'm jumping ahead to 371. It's still in the same chapter, but it is the very end of the Cypher speech. Cypher is asking Nero if he can see Wing, and Nero's like, "Bro, Wing has been through enough in this book, so why don't you put that idea back down where it came from?" So, "No matter how important you thought this was, too many people have died needlessly." This is Nero talking. "You've turned my own people against me, and as Cypher, you've stood for everything that I oppose. Your career has been one of needless brutality and horror. As far as the world is concerned, you're dead, and I intend to make sure it stays that way." "How very noble of you," Cypher snorted. "But if number one gets his way, and the streets of the world run red with blood, I wonder how well your principles will fare then." The edge of madness had returned to Cypher's voice, the obsession that had fueled the fire within him for so many years, all too plain to see. Nero gave him no answer. He just turned and walked out of the room. So, Cypher donned the mask to protect Wing. By the end, he no longer has a relationship with Wing to protect, per se. And in breaking the mask, losing that anonymity, Cypher can finally share the truth of everything that has been happening for the last 15 years. So Nero is now the recipient of the full truth. And that's like just a very like symbolic thing in and of itself, where it's like, now there's no mask, so now we can know the truth. But I would say this is also important because in losing his mask and in telling the truth, Cypher reverts back to what he was at the beginning on the mountain when he was Wu Zhang, which is to say he is a warning for Nero. He warned Nero not to bring Overlord online, and now he's here again saying your principles aren't going to save you. He is a omen of doom, and he is suggesting that Nero is unprepared for whatever lies in his future. And that was true the first time. And if we think of him as a kind of prophetic voice for what might happen in Escape Velocity, we have a sense that it might be true again. But that is not all, because although Cypher has lost his mask, when we think about the act of withholding, this is very relevant to Dr. Nero, because Dr. Nero has decided that he's going to hide Cypher in the mountain, and he's not going to tell Number One the truth about any of this. And so, while Cypher's mask has physically been broken and Cypher no longer feels the need to withhold, the legacy of his mask has been passed on to Nero to hold on to and to protect, so that he will know the truth and he will decide not to share it with people like Number One, who, again, is also masked. So now we are in this place where Nero and Number One are withholding things from each other, and there are other characters who may be impacted by the secrets they hold. And how is that all going to play out? We just don't know yet. But to kind of bring it all home, finally, for us, we also have to think about whether the secrets people have actually protect anyone. Cypher says he dons the mask to protect Wing. Nero is withholding the stuff he learns about Cypher from Number One to protect his school. And Number One is hiding his identity on the mountain to protect himself. And then Hive Mind has his emotion chip removed, to use the Star Trek parlance, to protect the students at the school as well. So in 3 out of the 4 cases, they're attempting to protect the children in their care. And then Number One is just on his own, which is very fair if you're a villain, I guess. I don't know. But so again, they want to protect people, but in many cases here, they are failing to protect the people they set out to protect. And so I think the use of the masks and then this recurring theme of withholding or not withholding, as in masking your emotions, helps us focus on who is being protected and why, and is that better off? Because Wing and the other children are meant to be protected, but the lack of honesty and the lack of upfrontness on all counts leads to, at the beginning, Wing and Otto being, they could have died. They didn't, but they could have. And similarly, when Cypher took over the school, they could have died, but they didn't. And none of the kids knew what was going on, really. And so this seems like a particularly relevant theme in a book written for preteens, where children are turning into teenagers, and there's that desire not to be protected anymore, and to be treated more like an adult as you are gaining in maturity. And it's interesting because I would say that in what we see with Cypher and Hive Mind and Number One and Nero is that Hive seems to agree. Only when Hive Mind and Cypher are unmasked do the students in the school gain safety and growth in the end. It's only after Cypher's mask is removed and that Hive Mind is allowed to be himself again that everything calms down and that we know that everybody is going to live in the end. Which then also means that it's worth noting that not everybody has been unmasked at the end. Nero is still masked and Number One is still masked. And as long as they remain masked, we have to consider that they are potentially actively putting these students in danger. And that we need to know more. And that, I think, is a great mindset to go into looking to escape velocity. So, so that is all my thoughts on masks and Cypher, and I think that there are many other characters who wear masks going forward, so it is a good kind of motif to keep an eye out for if you are reading for the first time. And I hope that this was both entertaining, maybe not entertaining, but informative and interesting if you haven't read the Overlord Protocol in that light before. So thanks for having me, Jade, and I will see y'all next time.
That's all for this episode. However, because I missed last week's, I'm going to put out 2 this week. So the next episode that's coming out is based on Escape Velocity, the 3rd book. And if you know what escape velocity means, you know exactly where we're going. See you at the next one.